Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to day three of iDTX 2022. That's it, you've made it to the last day. You can almost stop eating the tea and biscuits now. We're nearly there. But we have a full day of really fantastic sessions starting right now. So without further ado, I'm going to stop wasting time and hand over to Freya. Thank you so much, and I will hand you the screen.
Hello, I am super excited to be welcoming this fantastic community at iDTX today. Thank you so much, Tom, for having me here. And let's get started. So, my name is Shreya Gupta, and I work as a learning experience designer with Amazon. Spent the last couple of years empowering organizations to transform their training requirements and slay their business goals. As you can imagine, this journey has brought with itself a mix of various experiences for me as a designer. Let me walk you all through one of the most recent ones. So, I happened to work for a VILT curriculum, and one of the anecdotal feedback comments that we received as part of the evaluation of this curriculum was somewhere along the lines of how particularly boring this training was to this person, how disengaging it was, and what a waste of time it was. Now, I was concerned. I, as a designer, had after all put in my heart and soul into nurturing my baby, the design that is. So naturally, I was concerned. I decided to meet up with this person, who we later identified as Mark, in order to understand where this feedback was coming from. Upon conversing with Mark, it came to light that he was a tenured employee in the org, and therefore, a lot of topics and concepts that we were trying to teach everybody via this training were already known to him. So, naturally, all those 4 to 5 hours that he spent in taking the training were not as fruitful to him. At this point in time, I'd encourage you all to please leverage the chat and let me know how many similar marks have you all had the opportunity to come across during the course of your respective careers. I am pretty sure, even without looking at the chat right now, I can safely assume most of us would have encountered audience members who feel frustrated because they need to go through, rather sleepwalk through long hours of training and consume this one way delivery of content. That said, would you say we completely do away with synchronous trainings then? I wouldn't recommend that because there are a few processes, launches, or trainings that require those live interactions. And so, considering this is such a big pain point to our learners, is there a way that we designers can do something about it? Is there a way at all that we can train our employees and at the same time honor their time? Is there a way out at all? Well, turns out there is, and that is exactly what we're going to dive deeper into during our session today. So, the answer to this perpetual issue of time is the flipped classroom model. This is the agenda we're going to follow throughout our session today. And before we get into the whys and the whats, let us first look at a day as in the classroom, a day in a traditional blended curriculum classroom. So there's somebody who's leading the discussion, quite like how it used to happen back in school, right? Your learners come into the classroom cold, not really knowing what's going to be covered during the session today. They might get to watch a video or two, might even get to apply what they're learning, take an assessment, and that's about it. Now, compare this with what may happen in a flipped classroom. So, anything and everything that you'd want your learners to go through as part of the training, you share all of that with them prior to the start of the class. In other words, you're restructuring the approach of how synchronous and asynchronous trainings merge on the top of its head. So the classroom time is not spent in delivering core content. Rather, it is solely dedicated to peer interactions, live discussions, performance of your learner improvements, etc. Really depending on what suits your learners. So this is especially helpful to you as a designer because, as good ones at that, we do not want our learners to just retain what we're teaching them. we would also want them to be able to use it back on the job. And that's not all. There is another upside to using a flipped classroom model. It helps you hit all of the Bloom's taxonomy levels in a rather compartmentalized manner. So, when you're giving your learners the materials or deliverables as part of their homework, that is when you're following a behaviorist approach and you're hitting those knowledge or the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Then, when they enter the classroom, is where they get to compare, contrast, debate, even synthesize. So, that is where you're following a constructivist approach and hitting the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So, now that we've touched upon this a bit already, let's dive deeper into why does this model even exist? Why are we even having a discussion today around the benefits around this flipped classroom model? All right, so to give you all a bit of context, flipped classroom model is not that new as we might consider it to be. It has already proven its worth across academia, PhD classes, elementary schools, you know, and it's slowly and surely carving its way into the corporate world now, and that's not without a reason. The pandemic has really changed the way we all work and learn, hasn't it? And with these uncertain times, has re-emerged these few facts, these few truths that I would like to take you all through. So the very first truth with regards to our learners is our learners love to feel a sense of empowerment. You tell them that something is mandatory or something needs to be done a certain way, and they shut out. They just shut out. With flipped classroom approach, we give them the autonomy to choose a time frame, location, setting, weather conditions of their own choice, and take the materials in that setting. They love this freedom because they feel like we're trusting them as designers. Truth number two, employees come back and tell us that they love to put their heads together and brainstorm. So, a lot of times there are problems that we might want our learners to solve in their own time in silos, but that's not how it works well with them. Employees say that it's only when they get to tap into each other's experiences, diverse cultures, backgrounds, is when the magic happens. That is when they're able to come up with the best solutions to problems. So it's super important we give them that opportunity to collaborate. Thirdly, employees love working towards a purpose. They like to make an active participation to what they're learning. They like to have their voices heard. And this is super important because they want to go back to their work and apply what they've been learning here in class passionately. And so it's a very good idea to consider this approach because a flip model will help you get all of the foundation materials out of your way even before learning begins for your learners in the classroom. Secondly, it leaves you as a designer more scope to encourage interactions and discussions in the classroom. Thirdly, like we just discussed, it gives a great sense of empowerment to your learners. So your learners feel all the more prepared to discuss what they had learned in their own time when they come to the classroom. And fourthly, it allows you to gauge where your learners currently stand and to measure their outcomes, their performances better. All right. So we've already touched upon the theory, so let's leave that behind and get into the specifics. It is practical IDTX after all. So I'm going to throw out a few examples that you all can utilize as part of your design while working on a project that integrating this approach. But here's the caveat. There is no one size fits all approach when it comes to this model. And the success of it is going to solely depend on what you want to gain out of it and what your training objectives are. So let's look at what makes for a good flipped classroom learning. Here are a few suggestions you might want to factor in before, during, and after your training. To start off, you need to be super clear on the key messages and key data that you'd want your learners to walk away with or complete as part of their homework or pre work. Now, you could roll out these key messages in various forms and shapes. self paced demos, guided simulations, assigned readings, SOPs, e learnings, micro learnings, videos, podcasts. Gosh, the list is endless, right? At the same time, you would want to hold your learners accountable for their own learning. How do we achieve that? You could have some kind of self checks, like knowledge checks, or branched scenarios, or simply scenario based questions, practice case studies, etc. The idea is not to make anything super complicated as to overwhelm your learners. You only want them to know where the knowledge gaps lie so that they come back to the classroom and they can then discuss about that. All right. Once they get into the classroom, or should I ask you all for the ideas first? Okay, so before we look at what we have up on the slides here, let's hear from you all. How would you all encourage participation in the classroom? Please leverage the chat and let us know about your suggestions. The clock has already started to tick, and you have about a minute's time to answer. Remember, there are many a mark there who badly need our support, so make sure you're typing away your ideas. Hey, Mark, are you listening? We are discussing one of the biggest pain points here. Come on, people. Mark needs our support. It's the interactions that I really die for. It's the best part about speaking at conferences. So I'm really thankful to everybody who's here with us today and who's sending in their responses. It always helps to learn from each other, doesn't it? Hey, Jeremy, great suggestion there. Thanks. Absolutely, what's in it for me right up front? hmm Explaining the whys, the whats, etc. Super important. Implementing flipped classroom can really be a tricky one, but well, hopefully this session will cover some of the doubts you might have when you start off. White spaces so that we don't overwhelm or scare people off at the start. Yes. All right. So I think you've been able to crack the code already. Thanks to Remy and everybody who was thinking about it. So here's what we have on the slide. So make sure that when you begin with the session in the classroom, there's an opportunity for your learners to talk about what topics they want to revisit even before the practices start, right? You could have some kind of vote or a poll or a show of hands or just something, so that your learners can request for topics for a recapitulation. And this is super important, very, very important. And this is the time when just in times come in really, really handy, which also means you'll need to prep your facilitators up in advance so that they know what videos or micro learnings or debrief documents should they pick up for the topics that your audience have requested for. At the same time, it's a great opportunity for you to encourage interactions. So, a lot of times, employees come back and say, in theory, everything made perfect sense to them, but they struggle to apply the very same concepts back at work. So, classroom sessions are the times when you would want to make sure that your learners interpret the content we are offering them and they're able to apply it in a safe environment at the classroom and then later back at work. How do we achieve that? You could have a mix of activities in the classroom: Jeopardy games, scavenger hunts, pairs and shares activities, where you could divide the entire class into various groups. Each group might want to go through one of the assigned sections of a SOP or just something, that you'd want them to go through. And then they present their findings or their understanding to the entire class. So that way they get an opportunity to get feedback on what their understanding of this reading was and understand whether or not they're on the right track. That said, it's also important for your facilitators at this time to address any clarifying questions your learners might have. And your facilitators might even want to have a one to one coaching with your employees, just so that they could point them back to the right information, to the right resources, and the right understanding. Once you've reached towards the end of the session, there's something else that you need to do. Again, let's see what all ideas you have to say and to use for this kind of a setting. What do you think? How would you tie everything back at the end of the session? What ideas do you all have? Please use the chat and send in your responses. Closing a flipped classroom can be tricky. So it's important that we know what all things we have or what all ideas we have at our disposal so that what we started off ends well too. Come on, people, this is practical iDTX and it has to be interactive. This is a great opportunity for us to learn and exchange ideas so that we know that we're understanding and we will be able to use this going forward across our projects. The clock's ticking. People, we need your support. Mark does. Mark needs your support. Mhm. Summarizing is a great opportunity, yes, for us to understand whether they've understood the content and for them to also identify whether they have or not. Agreed. Thanks, Jeremy. What other ideas do you all have? Just a couple more seconds and I will take you through what I would like to suggest. Handouts and projects. Mhm. Yes, we could hand over to our learners some of the resources or just some most important highlights of the session. That would be super helpful, yes. All right, while you're sending in your suggestions, let me show you what we have in here. Okay, so closing is the time when learning must come a full circle for your learners. So everything that they've learned at the moment or until now should tie back to where they all started off. It's a great opportunity for your facilitators to debrief your audience now. Address any further follow up questions your employees may have, talk about any forthcoming launch announcements, or talk about next steps that we would want our participants to take once they walk away and walk out of this training. This is also a good opportunity for your learners to reflect on what activities they just participated in, talk about the actions that they took during those activities and the rationale behind it. And in case their rationale is not up to the mark, then again, your facilitators have an opportunity to coach them, to guide them, interact with them. So these were some of the tips that I wanted to share with you all. And now that it's super clear that a flipped classroom model can really up the game and it is super rewarding, and yet you have to make sure that you take into consideration a few pointers just so that you can make this model all the more effective. So, number one, make sure that you're investing enough time and effort into creating the deliverables. Ask yourself questions like, what should my deliverables look like? Where can my participants access those? And at the same time, like I said, previously, you don't have to make anything super complicated because that's not the idea. You only want your learners to be held accountable for their own learning, and you only want them to get the foundational knowledge at this time before they're coming into the classroom. Second, you must ensure that your learners feel supported throughout because, as part of the flipped classroom model, you're asking them to do some additional work upfront. You are asking them to take things in their own time. So they might be looking for support already even before they come to the classroom. Let them know what are these materials they need to access. Where can they access those from? What all repositories do they have at their disposal? Where can they seek support in times of need? Also, it's a great time for you to aim to create a robust curriculum in terms of accessibility. So, captioning your videos, utilizing the right design and font, summarizing where you can, utilizing screen readers, etc., can be some very good options here. Thirdly, set up your participants for success right from the start. Let them know what's changing. Let them know about the what's in it for me right from the start. Let them know what are our expectations of them now that this change is coming along. All of this is going to help them get into the rhythm of the change, get into that changed mindset even before they step into the classroom. And this is important because otherwise, you might be in for some negative reviews from your participants, just the way the kind of comments that we receive from Mark. We wouldn't want that to happen. So it's very important that you involve your audience from the very beginning. Tell them early and tell them often. And finally, make sure that you're prepared to handle any scenarios where your learners come to the classroom underprepared or not prepared at all. One of the best ways to do that is to let them know ahead of time the repercussions of not coming prepared to the classroom. You might also want to let them know about the rewards or the benefits if they do come prepared. In fact, I encourage you all to go a step further and employ gamification as part of your classroom activities. So you could just, who doesn't want be to hear about their names being called out as winners, isn't it? And your learners are not going to be any exceptions in there. So these are some of the things that you could hold in mind while you're creating a flipped classroom model. All right, so the question that remains to be discussed now really is to flip or not to flip. Well, I would say you decide per your training objectives, your time, and your budget constraints. Because if you ask me, I am all for utilizing this model. It's pretty apparent, it changes the way we think, work, and apply. So, in my opinion, it not just allows your learners to participate actively with your facilitators and with the content, but it also helps us to make sure that they do not need to passively sit through trainings for long hours. It's totally a win win and totally worth a try, in my opinion. All right, so we've come to the end of the session already. And before we see what all questions you have for me, I would like to let you all know that I have some closing thoughts for you all. So never, ever, ever, ever underestimate the power that you all bring to the table as fantastic L&D professionals. You've been doing an excellent job creating all of these insightful, impactful designs and pieces of learning over the years, and you will continue doing that going forward. The only thing that remains to be done now, more than ever before, is to do things a little differently tomorrow than how you have been doing up until today. And this is because, as L&D magicians, as I'd like to call all of us, we don't just want our learners to strive, but thrive. All right, and on that note, let's open the floor for any questions. Over to you, Tom.
So there's usually a few minutes of delay on the chat. So let's,
Mhm.
maybe not a few minutes, a few seconds maybe. So anyone
Sure.
with any questions, jump in. Now's the time.
There are a lot of questions online for Flip Classroom. I'm hoping to see as many here in the group as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose one question I do have actually is how do you go about deciding whether or not it is the right approach for a specific intervention?
Right, and that's a great question. Thanks, Tom. So, one of the things that I would want to consider before I start off creating this kind of a model is understand how much of practice intervention would I like as part of this training. Because if you see, a flipped classroom model encourages us to maximize our time with the participants. And that way, we're encouraging discussions and activities a lot. Because our aim is to make sure that everybody in the audience is able to get a deeper understanding of what we've asked them to take, right?
Mm.
And instead of letting our facilitators take the time in delivering content, we use their expertise, we leverage their expertise rather to, ask to answer questions or to point us back to the right information in terms of the training content. So yeah, that's one of the first considerations. And then of course, depending on the org you're working for, depending on the team you are on, you might want to factor in the time and budget that you have. So these are three most important things you should bear in mind before you start off with this approach in your design.
Awesome. No, that's really helpful. And I suppose one thing to definitely ask is what kind of results have you seen where you've implemented this?
So I'm currently working on one, and one of the feedback comments that we've already received for that one is very, very good because we decided to use a survey ahead of time and roll that out to participants when we were doing a piloting. And this is something that I would recommend you all to do as well, rather than taking this up at the very start. Have it as part of your pilot testing first so that you're
Mm.
just implementing this on one batch rather than doing it together on multiple batches, and that batch will come back and give you some good feedback so that you know whether or not the approach is working, and if it is not, then what is it that you can do differently so that you can support them all the more. So yeah, in terms of metrics, I do not have a number at this time, but we've received some good positive feedback from our pilot batch employees already.
Awesome. So we've got some questions coming in. We've got one from Mohammed here. Unfortunately, joined a little bit late. Well, that's okay. You can always catch the full session on the recap recordings as well. But could you please tell him if you mentioned if you make flip classrooms for everything, basically onboarding right the way through to closing?
Absolutely. In fact, I can cite one of the examples for onboarding. So perhaps you're creating a flipped classroom model on a onboarding curriculum. How do you approach that one? In my opinion, you might want to, as part of the pre-work, send out regulatory requirements to your participants, that they would need to abide by now that they've joined the org. That is one of the deliverables you could use as part of their homework. Then there are various other things you might want to let them know about the leaders that you have, the various repositories that you have, various links that they should be bookmarking now that they've joined the team, about their buddy, and you might also want to have some coffee shuffles with them right at the start. So these are some of the things that, yes, are coming to my mind on the top of my head right now with regards to onboarding. And absolutely, again, depending on what you want to gain out of your training, what your objectives are, you might want to align this approach with any and every topic really that you're working on.
Brilliant. And Another one here. What's the best way to teach instructional design theories using the flipped classroom? I would give them a YouTube video or reading before the class. What activities would you suggest in the classroom to supplement these readings to help them learn these theories in an engaging manner?
In the classroom, I would say they could perhaps, again, discuss what they had learned with the group, and then they could present it to the class so that everybody can give them the feedback. And we discussed this as part of the session as well, because in my opinion, these kind of parent share activities are really helpful for us to gauge whether learners are able to interpret content, and for them also to identify whether or not they're getting things, they're grasping what we're asking them to. Apart from YouTube videos and readings, they might want to also come back and engage in some role play activities or question and answer activities. Let's say there's a group of classroom. We might want to divide it into two groups. So group A is where um, which represents theory A. Group B is which represents theory B. Group A is going to talk about their theory. Group B will talk about theirs, and then all of both of these groups will have the opportunity to ask questions with regards to the theory that the other group is representing. And that way, it's going to be a great opportunity for everybody to learn from each other, and also to just to make sure that everybody is on the same page, everybody is getting in terms of what we're trying to teach them. And it could also be a good idea to encourage discussions around examples, right? So not just laying out the theory as is, but leveraging examples that they might have in their head or they might have read up somewhere. That would be, again, a super, super helpful session for everybody in the classroom.
Fantastic. And we've got one last question that came in the Q&A, and it actually links to a question that was discussed yesterday, where we were talking about learning personas. But how would you go about catering to kind of different people's preferences when it comes to learning within a flipped classroom, so that we're not just forcing everyone to have exactly the same thing?
Right. And that's a great question again. I think one of the things that I would want to do is, like I just said, have some kind of a pilot group and test this approach on them. Secondly, we might want to go and pull out a survey or a vote of or poll of some kind and share that out with the group that's going to come into the training some days after. That way, you could come to know in advance what all support they require and how best we can support them. So it's a great way to understand various requirements, and it's also a great way to analyze our audience right at the start rather than then struggling to adapt this change to the training audience. I think these are the two ways I would go about it. I hope that was useful.
Oh, fantastic. Great stuff. So there's been loads there. Oh, actually, we've got some more coming in. I think Jeremy was saying at the start of the pandemic, he turned a 3 day classroom session into a blended pre-learning, 3 hours total, some pre-work, three 1.5 hour VLT sessions. The results were amazing. And I think, yeah, this is exactly what you're talking about, isn't it? This is the kind of impact this can have.
Thanks for sharing that, Remy. That's great feedback. And yeah, like you just mentioned, I think results of blended or flipped, whatever you may want to call it, are always amazing, especially during these times when we're heading, well, we've already headed towards this kind of a change setting where
Hmm.
most classrooms have converted into virtual ones. And when I say blended or flipped, well, flipped is really an offshoot to a blended classroom. It is essentially a blended model, but the way we are converging how the digital assets merge with the synchronous trainings or time, that is different. And it really depends on your approach, depends on your objectives. You might want to go for a blended model, you might want to go for a flipped one, again, depending on what results you might want to see later.
Absolutely fantastic. So, I think we've. There's nothing else in the Q&A. There's nothing else in the chat. So I just want to say thank you so much for this really fantastic presentation, and staying around to do this. So we've got obviously loads more sessions coming up today, but in the meantime, please do all make use of the networking areas, the session tables, the general chat. If people want to get in touch with you, Trey, what's the best way for them to do that?
Sure, I'll be happy to take up any queries or any feedback or even any experiences that you all may have around flipped classroom models. So make sure that you're keeping the conversation flowing. Pour in your comments in the comment section. I'll be happy to network with you all. Look forward to connecting with you all. Also, there was the slide that I had at the last, and you will also find that in the comments in the description box. So there are some links to my online channels. You might want to subscribe to them, might want to follow them, and yeah, just let's share. Let's connect and share. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the morning, everyone. I will see you at the next session.